IVE's XOXZ arrives with all the hallmarks of their signature sound. We have glossy production, a moody atmosphere, and a narrative steeped in allure and secrecy. Fittingly so, given the overarching concept of this new album is IVE Secret. On the surface, it's exactly what we've come to expect from the group, sleek and cinematic pop that keeps IVE at the center of K-pop's conversation around style and identity. But here's the catch. XOXZ, for all its great atmosphere, feels a little hollow when set aside IVE's strongest title tracks. It's a great song, immediately added to the choujimi charts, but it seems to be missing that thing that usually makes IVE's work feel so definitive. After listening to this album and sitting with it, I think this is deliberate, a reflection of the album's larger theme about secrecy. A secret works when it keeps some things hidden, right? So what is IVE's secret with this album? Let's discuss. Songs like Love Dive, I Am, and Off the Record do well at presenting atmosphere in a similar way to this song, but they also add a layer of vulnerability and tension that deepens the narrative. In Love Dive, those yearning, ooh ad-libs give the glossy production an emotional spine, making the song's confidence feel tied to longing and risk. In I Am, the soaring chorus and pure vocal intensity underline the story of self-discovery, making it feel personal and triumphant rather than just glamorous. XOXZ, by comparison, feels a little too controlled. The atmosphere is cinematic, but the song doesn't let through the same raw emotional cues as before. Whether that's a vocal flourish, a melodic shift, or a lyric that pierces, cleanly through the stylization. It almost feels like the secret concept of the album is embedded a little too well here. The vulnerability that we've come to expect from IVE is hidden behind the mystique, leaving listeners with style and mood, but not the heartbeat that usually distinguishes IVE's work. So I think what feels off isn't that XOXZ is weak as a song, it's just that it leans heavier into concept and polish than into the often small human moments of ache or triumph that make IVE's narrative arcs resonate. In short, I believe XOXZ is a very strong aesthetic piece, but a less emotionally textured one, and for a reason. This is kind of a hard conversation to have because IVE has always maintained a certain artistic distance in their music. Love Dive, for example, doesn't draw you in through narrative clarity. The narrator never explains why she ultimately chooses herself, but it still resonates because the atmosphere does the emotional heavy lifting. Those haunting ooh ad-libs are a window into the ache beneath the surface, giving listeners a sense of the sacrifice and yearning at play. Where would Love Dive be without those ooh ad-libs? Probably still effective and stylish, but far less poignant. I think that's where XOXZ seems to differ in IVE's discography. It establishes a sleek mood, but doesn't layer in enough musical texture to illuminate the deeper emotional stakes, leaving the song compelling in concept, but slightly underwhelming in feeling. The production leans into shadowy synths and pulsing beats, all of it carefully polished to create a sense of grandeur wrapped in this secrecy. The pacing feels deliberate, savoring in the moments of tension it creates, a musical effect that mirrors the narrative's theme of hidden truths. There's something that goes so obviously unsaid behind this song's message. It's a little off-putting on first impression, but again, I think that's the point. The recurring line and also title of this song, XOXZ, which means I love you goodnight, is deceptively simple, but it carries weight precisely because of the song's restrained atmosphere. In an otherwise kind of vague narrative, it's oftentimes the only thing that breaks through. Surrounded by mysterious production, the XOXZ feels like a command. It's intimate yet evasive.
Give me the X, give me the O, give me the L-O-V-E, 말하면 다, I want it all.
The instrumentation underscores this tension. The smooth bass lines and very airy synths create a cinematic sense of distance between IVE and the narrator. The words sung and spoken feel like a very final thing, emphasized by the blunt brass instrumentation behind them. The refrain, I love you, good night, captures this perfectly. It's tender but commanding, suggesting a narrator who offers just enough affection to hold someone close while simultaneously closing the door with a sense of distance. The secrecy of the song's concept is baked into the music. The sleek synths and clipped brass hits create an atmosphere of allure and detachment, so the listener is placed in the position of really trying to decode the narrator's true feelings. Is this about genuine love? Is it about a fleeting romance, or is it only a controlled facade of affection? I can't tell you for sure, I don't know, but that ambiguity seems intentional. Narratively, XOXZ is about the thrill and danger of affection that hides more than it reveals. In this way, the title of the song doesn't resolve the song's emotional core, but actually amplifies the ambiguity. It's both a declaration and a parting shot of Cupid's arrow. That secrecy, the choice to let the music veil rather than reveal, is what makes XOXZ effective in a roundabout way, even if it, in the end, sacrifices some of the visceral ache that defined IVE's earlier songs. On the surface, XOXZ presents itself as a love song, but peel back the layers and it becomes less about love and affection and more about control. The repeated "I love you, good night" doesn't feel like the gentle closure of a romantic confession. It feels more like a way of asserting dominance by deciding when the conversation ends. The absence of more narrative detail, the fact that we're never given the backstory of a relationship or the narrator's true sense of vulnerability, becomes part of the power play here. By withholding this kind of information, the narrator controls the flow of intimacy, offering only fragments of affection while keeping the upper hand. Musically, I feel like this all ties back to the brass and clipped production. There's no lingering ache or yearning here like we see on Love Dive, only very blunt finality, like the narrator has already made the choice and is dictating the terms for this song. XOXZ functions as a subtle, more enigmatic display of power. Not really a love song when you think about the broader implications of secrecy as a concept. The result of all of this is a track with not as much emotional texture and, I guess, immediacy that we've come to expect from IVE. That is, on my first impression at least. XOXZ doesn't pierce through its own polish, and in doing so risks feeling, in some ways, too tightly controlled. Still, this restraint could be seen as IVE trying to expand their palette, to explore what happens when mood and elegance are prioritized over immediacy and just raw feeling. I think this loss of emotional texture is felt by the end, but is supported in some ways by this concept of secrecy.
Like the girls always 오래된 나의 friend.
Very similar to XOXZ, the next track Wildbird thrives on this sense of restraint as a compositional tool for the album. From a technical standpoint, the arrangement often teases at moments of full release. Sweeping synth pads swell, percussion builds towards an expected climax, yet the song repeatedly pulls back at the last second. This use of delayed resolution creates a constant sense of hesitation. In my mind, it musically refers to the lyrical undercurrents of doubt that may be fueling this withholding of information and vulnerability. We have a narrator who no longer feels confident with her feelings enough to invoke them for these kinds of messages. Wildbird's restraint hides ideas of rebellion beneath our narrator's otherwise graceful exterior. The vocal layering, these airy falsettos and breathy harmonies tucked behind the leading lines, mirrors these secret ideas that linger just beneath the surface. When the chorus finally blooms into fuller instrumentation, the release feels like defiance. The narrator finally gives voice to their core sense of longing. The imagery of flight becomes metaphorical and also musical. Light melodic motifs throughout the song mimic the flutter of wings, while subtle and rhythmic syncopations destabilize the otherwise polished frame, hinting at a kind of restlessness. Narratively, I think Wildbird sits at the same table as Rebel Heart, carrying forward the theme of rebellion as a kind of internalized yearning to break free. Both songs present freedom as something elusive to them, but so essential to who they are and what they want to become. Wildbird cloaks its rebellion in IVE's characteristic elegance, making the act of restraint itself part of the storytelling this time. This begins to flesh out the universal secret concept of the album further. Wildbird is about a very quiet kind of rebellion, a silent refusal to be fully contained, wrapped in the as always delicate poise of IVE's delivery. So in this way, the track expands IVE's conceptual identity, adding depth to their portrayal of characters who crave autonomy while still operating within structures that demand grace and control. Seems very indicative of the idol experience. The next song, Dear My Feelings, is a striking pivot on IVE Secret, both narratively and also sonically, breaking open the album's otherwise guarded detachment and offering something more candid and very self-reflective. Where the last two songs thrived on restraint, Dear My Feelings turns inward, casting its gaze toward the oh-so-poignant memory. The retro-inspired production immediately signals this reflective persona or presence. Very warm synth tones and softened percussion evoke the lyrical feeling of reading through an old diary, the analog textures carrying that certain feeling of nostalgia. Even the slightly, I would say, hazy mixing choices feel deliberate on this song, as if the track itself is blurred around the edges, like the uncertain parts of memories. The arrangement plays directly into the theme of looking back with embarrassment and also, importantly, a kind of tenderness. The melodic phrasing often circles back on itself, repeating motifs in a slightly altered way each time. In my mind, this mimics the way memories kind of resurface in fragments. They're never exactly the same each time, and always so tinged by hindsight. The instrumentation holds back from heavy layering this time, instead opting for spare and glimmering flourishes, almost twinkling synths that create space for the vocals to carry the weight of confession. Vocally, the delivery is less polished than in the last two tracks, leaning into a softness that works to humanize our narrator, inviting the listener closer than the group typically allows. This is where the track's conceptual strength lies. It becomes a moment of disarming openness. Dear My Feelings marks a sudden turning point in the album. If XOXZ and Wildbird establish control and restraint as dominant themes, this track functions as a rare disclosure of what lies beneath that exterior. By admitting to embarrassment over a younger self's inability to articulate her feelings, the narrator acknowledges the hidden costs of emotional distance. And these ideas about control, right? She isn't wallowing in her own regrets, though. The refrain, "I love my own feelings," simple enough, becomes a mantra of self-acceptance. It reframes past mistakes as necessary steps towards self-knowledge and self-acceptance. This song redefines the emotional stakes of IVE SECRET. It pulls back the curtain and briefly lets listeners into the heart of the narrator, suggesting that all the elegance and power and restraint showcased before are still underpinned by very real, very human vulnerabilities. We then get Gotcha, Baddest, Eros, which, whoa. Definitely the most theatrical moment on IVE SECRET. This is the exterior to the beating heart of this album that hides the more emotionally complex interior. Where Dear My Feelings peeled back layers of vulnerability, Gotcha does the opposite, fully leaning into the spectacle and sinister edge that our narrator has established at the start of this album. By invoking Eros or Cupid as a mythological anchor, the track transforms this signal of innocent affection into a weapon of control. Cupid's arrow is not simply a messenger of love, but the very mechanism by which desire is dictated, manipulated, and controlled. Thematically, this reimagining of Eros as Baddest situates the narrator as sovereign. The instrumental arrangement builds itself around sharp staccato beats and ornamental flourishes that mimic the tension of a bowstring being pulled out. Percussive accents then cut through this mix, evoking the suddenness of Cupid's arrow piercing its target. It's so great. The use of syncopation in the bass and rhythm section destabilizes the listener just enough to mirror the, unpredictability of desire. It works to suggest that love under IVE's control is less of a gentle coaxing into feeling and more like a calculated ambush. Our narrator is both the archer and the arrow. Again, we're faced with this commanding rather than yearning presence that we see on XOXZ. It reflects the album's ongoing preoccupation with power over vulnerability. It's the small production choices, the reverb echoes, the strategic pauses before the beat slams back in. It all functions musically like these withheld secrets, musical sleights of hand that keep the listener anticipating the next strike. At the moment, I think this is my favorite song in the album. Gotcha embodies the album's almost obsession with secrets that hide in plain view. The track solidifies the album's primary thesis that relationships, at least in our narrator's perspective, are battlegrounds of power and performance. The song feels like a staged showcase, and I love it. The next song, Heartbeats, then collapses these ideas about intimacy and control into something deceptively playful, almost too sweet on the surface, but again, deeply calculated underneath. Gotcha is about the shot of Cupid's arrow, and then maybe Heartbeats is about what happens after. The way a person's heart, once it's struck, is monitored and kept in check. The track leans into an electronic pop structure with pulsating synths and heartbeat mimicking percussion, literalizing the song's concept. The bassline is a steady thrum against which the brighter melodic elements dart around like sudden adrenaline spikes. The percussive syncopation here feels overly metallic and mechanical in places. Again, the narrator isn't merely responding to love, but actively orchestrating the rhythm of it. This push and pull between an organic pulse and otherwise artificial programming gives the track a kind of dual quality. Love is both something alive and something engineered in some ways. I think the vocal production plays a crucial role in building this kind of tension. Whispery layers and tightly compressed harmonies blur the edges of the human voice, at times feeling so digitized, as though the narrator herself has become a kind of metronome that dictates her partner's heartbeats. The hooks are catchy enough to make this feel lighthearted, but there's an undercurrent of relentlessness that makes it feel so inescapable, sort of driving home the idea of dominance through the song's repetition. The chorus then heightens this sensation by folding into brighter synth stabs and very decorative flourishes that contrast the darker undertones of the verses. It's, again, sweet on the surface, but the structure is airtight, giving the listener so little room to breathe. The playful tonality disguises an undercurrent of possession, another very clever inversion of the developing, love song as an action of surrendering. In the wider frame of IVE Secret, Heartbeats slips into something more subtle again, this controlled disguise as tenderness, right? Not all forms of dominion are loud. Some arrive dressed as comfort and care, pulsing gently in the background until you realize the song has dictated every breath you've taken along the way. The final song, Midnight Kiss, then develops another surprising pull to the album's push. This song is anchored in a disarming nocturnal palette, very low and velvety synth pads that ebb and flow throughout. Percussion is still restrained as ever, and melodic lines that stretch long before hitting the chorus. The tempo is slower here, again giving the illusion of intimacy unfolding at its own pace. But if we've learned nothing else from the roller coaster that is IVE Secret, this sense of restraint is the power move. The narrator no longer needs, musically, the brass stabs or rigid syncopation to assert herself. Instead, she dominates the space by withholding, by inviting the listener into a soundscape so shadowed that every small detail feels so monumental. The chorus arrives with layered vocals that cascade. Harmonies are stacked so well in a way that creates a sense of enveloping warmth, but as always, there's a subtle detachment in the mixing. The voices feel close, yet never fully tangible. Like the narrator is present but still just out of reach for some reason. A kiss is offered at midnight, but the secrecy around what it means remains intact. By the end of this album, we still really aren't given an answer. Is this genuine affection or some final gesture of dominance? The song never tells you outright, which is precisely the point. I'm kind of losing my mind here, wrapped in so much secrecy and hidden truths by the end of this album. The instrumentation makes this kind of duplicity very vivid. Small glimmers of high-pitched synth arpeggios flicker in the background. It gives me the vibe of looking at starlight or distant city lights at midnight. The balance of light and shadow in the arrangement paints this kiss as both tender and also foreboding. It's something you lean into knowing it might also conceal a trap or a catch. Something still remains unsaid by the end of this album, and it works to drive the listener a little crazy. By the end, to me, IVE Secret feels like a recalibration of IVE's artistic identity. I feel like we're building a bridge conceptually to something that was first explored in Love Dive. The narrator that is IVE is frequently unreliable, and IVE Secret seems like we're building up to an extensive look into why that is, and the inner workings of this secrecy. Love Dive frames the group's emotional distance as a mystique, inviting the listener to ache alongside the unresolved longing in the ooh-ooh ad-libs, but IVE Secret kind of doubles down on that distance, acknowledging it and increasing the distance as we go, carving out a narrator who is even colder, even more deliberate in her actions. The atmosphere across IVE Secret is strikingly reminiscent of the darkness that gave Love Dive its edge, yet instead of yearning, the mood here shifts towards pure dominance at times. Emotions here are not revealed, and that withholding of information becomes the whole point. Musically, this album thrives in its texture of contrast. XOXZ embodies this detached narrator most clearly. The clipped brass, the sparse percussive palette, and the matter-of-fact refrain of I love you, good night, which, despite its absence of genuine emotional texture, lands very effectively. Wildbird then counterbalances that with an airy sense of freedom, but even in the song's lightness, there's a sense of hidden rebellion rather than open-hearted flight. Dear My Feelings and Midnight Kiss pull us closer to vulnerability, yet they conceal intimacy in this universal, conceptual, quiet restraint, giving the listener only fragments of personal history or so fleeting moments of connection. On the opposite end, Gotcha makes this power clearly overt, and Heartbeats works to underscore how even affection can be filtered out and presented with controlled distance. All taken together, and in immediate retrospect, IVE Secret is really about the art of withholding. It plays with you on the surface, sharp and as glamorous as ever when it comes to IVE, while hinting at something I think more honest hidden beneath. This creates a narrator unlike anything IVE has embodied before, deliberately hard to read. Where their earlier hits offered atmosphere as a way to suggest longing or choice, giving us a window into how they actually feel, this record uses atmosphere to establish power, secrecy, and genuine dominion. It pushes the group's storytelling into new territory, proving that emotional nuance can also be built from silence and restraint, and really the refusal to let the listener all the way in. It builds on topics discussed so far in their career. IVE Mine deals a lot with topics of concealment and restraint, and this album seems to be building up to some kind of thematic or narrative scaffolding with all of that in mind. All in all, a resoundingly excellent project from IVE, as always at this point, built in a way that gets me excited, really excited, and guessing about what comes next. They are really storytellers in a sense when it comes to concept work, both narratively and musically, and I really like that more members are getting involved with writing. Yeah, by the end, on first impression, 10 out of 10, this album is great, but this is what I think. Please let me know what you feel about this album. Do you interpret the concept of secrecy in a different way? What are your favorite songs on first impression? How do you think they're effective, and things like that? Yes, thank you for watching this. If you did, subscribe if you want to, and I will see you next time.